Good afternoon and good morning to our West Coast listeners. My name is Juan Thomas. I have the honor of serving as chair of the American Bar Association Civil Rights and Social Justice section. Welcome to our weekly chair chat. And I'm so honored today to have the Honorable Al Green, Congressman from the 9th District of Texas, as our guest. Congressman Green, welcome to our chair chat. We're so honored to have you today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is indeed an honor to be on with you. I've been looking forward to this, and I'm very excited about the opportunity to talk about some of the things of interest to you.
Well, thank you so much again for being with us today. I want our audience to know that back in March, you were our keynote speaker for our Economic Justice Summit at the Georgetown Law Center. We are forever grateful to you for being our speaker, for coming. And then I also want to thank you again publicly for inviting me and our staff director, Paula Shapiro, to the remembrance commemoration of the Holocaust back in mid-April at the Capitol. So we're so grateful for your friendship and your relationship that we are building with our section. I look forward to a continued relationship and partnership with you. And that leads me to some very important work you are doing in Congress called Your Conscious Agenda, Our Moral Imperative. Could you kind of share with us what the pillars of that agenda is specifically?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to do so. And thank you for being a part of the commemoration ceremony for the Holocaust. It was an event that I shall remember. I literally had tears to well in my eyes as some of the things were told, the stories were told. The conscious agenda emanates from the notion first that the conscious, which is something within us that says this is right or this is wrong, once the conscious tells you that you've got something that's wrong, then you have something called a moral imperative to right the wrong. The wrong that we speak of is this. We have people who have been disrespected in this country since their first arrival. They've been disrespected, they've been neglected. And there has been almost a plan, certainly a desire, that these persons be the perfect victim, meaning that they suffer these indignations and humiliations, but they don't complain, and that they embrace an alternative reality about what actually happened in our country. On August the 19th of 1619, August 20th of 1619, the White Lion docked in a place called Point Comfort, which is now what we call Norfolk, Virginia, or near there. And in so doing, they brought 20 persons of African ancestry. The number can vary depending on the historian that recites the story. And these persons were the first persons who were traded into slavery in this country. That's well, right. Since that day, which was a seminal moment in time, impacting the rest of time in this country, we've had the problem of trying to right this wrong, correct this injustice, and not have persons be the perfect victim. For example, we in this country have revered the enslavers, the Confederate soldiers, and reviled the enslaved. Well, you're asking the people who are descendants of the people who laid the foundation, the economic foundation for the country. We call them the foundational mothers and fathers, the enslaved people, helped to build the White House, helped to build the Capitol, helped build roads and bridges, planted the crops, fed the country. We reviled them, and they would have the descendants appreciate the fact that their ancestors have been reviled. Well, that would make us the perfect victim if we did this. So we can't be the perfect victim. We refuse to, and as a result, we believe there ought to be a Slavery Remembrance Day, just as there's a Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day, just as there's a 9/11 Remembrance Day, just as there's a Holocaust Remembrance Day. Because like the Holocaust, this is one of the greatest crimes ever committed against humanity. There's nothing like the Holocaust, and there's nothing like slavery. So we want to have slavery remembrance. And then we believe that if we can, as we did in 1956, accord the enslavers, meaning the Confederate soldiers, a Congressional Gold Medal, the highest honor that Congress can bestow. We place that on the enslavers, the Confederate soldiers. We think that we ought to accord a Congressional Gold Medal to the enslaved. This would be an indication of our no longer having to live under this cloud of being reviled and being expected to appreciate the way our ancestors have been mistreated and neglected. We cannot be the perfect victims.
You know, your agenda underscores the importance of knowing history and understanding U.S. history, particularly the role of the enslaved African in the context of our broader American story. Could you speak to the importance of students and young people knowing their history? As you know, there's a pushback around the country about books that students can read or should be reading. We see that in states like Florida, and I believe also in your state of Texas. Could you kind of underscore why history is important?
Well, thank you.
Go ahead.
There's a pushback on, as you've indicated, and there's also a push forward. As they're pushing back, meaning pushing some books out of schools, they're pushing forward certain concepts that should be taught. For example, in the state of Texas, there was a movement afoot to call slavery involuntary relocation. This is what I mean about being a perfect victim. The perfect victim accepts that and says, okay, it was involuntary relocation. We didn't want to come. We were forced to come. But it was about more than that. If you know the history, then you know that it was about kidnapping. You know that it was about rape. It was about murder. It was about people being born into slavery, living their lives as slaves, and dying as slaves. And it was about those persons laying the economic foundation for the country. And why is this important? Because if we know this, those of us who are descendants, it causes us to be proud of our ancestors. We have been taught literally to revile our ancestors and revere the people who enslaved them. Well, we will at some point be proud to say, I am a proud descendant of the enslaved people who laid the economic foundation upon which this country stands today. That's who we are. And if you know your history, you can do this. But also, if you know your history, you know that when slavery ended and when the 13th Amendment was passed, it really did not end white supremacy. And it is white supremacy to this day that we still are having to cope with and deal with, because white supremacy evolved. It went from slavery to what we call convict leasing. In Texas, in Houston, Sugar Land, 95 bodies in a common grave. These were people who were leased to a plantation to work, lived and died as people leased. Slavery by any other name, leased. And we found that after that occurred, we had then lawful segregation. The state sanctioned separating people, separate bathrooms. I had to go to colored water fountains to drink my water, go into colored bathrooms to relieve myself, go to the back door to get my food, sit in the balcony of the movie. And if we were locked up, it was in the bottom of the jail. So we have gone through the segregation, and that was all about, again, white supremacy. So to this day, white supremacy has metamorphosed into various aspects of society, such that we, if we don't understand the history, don't understand what we're dealing with. And once we understand our history, we can then better deal with, not cope with, but deal with the issue of white supremacy. And white supremacy is still to this day what caused people to march through the streets in Charlottesville saying, Jews will not replace us. That was white supremacy. They wanted to remain on top. And if this is allowed, those people, if they can do this with impunity, imagine what happens when you go in for a loan and you encounter one of those persons that were out there with the tiki torches saying Jews will not replace us. Imagine what would happen to your loan if you're a Jewish person. Imagine what happens if you go into a place that serves food and one of these persons happens to be in the kitchen serving your food. We still have these issues to deal with that are open and notorious, but also some that are very subtle and can have an adverse impact on our lives, and we never know exactly what happened to us.
I want to pick up on your example of trying to get a loan, which would be you walking into a bank or an institution. One of the pillars of your agenda is the enactment of the Security and Exchange Atonement Act,
Yes.
where you're calling for an investigation into financial companies' historical connections to slavery. And that really speaks to an issue that I wanted to ask you about specifically around white supremacy, racism, slavery. It's not just individual acts by individual people. It's been institutionalized. It's part of policy. It was the law in Congress, state legislatures, but also in corporate America. Could you kind of speak to that act that you are proposing and connecting institutional white supremacy and racism to our present day reality?
Yes, let's just start with this, and I'll walk up to where you are. With what happened with redlining. Redlining was lawful in this country, literally, meaning there were certain areas wherein the government said, because these persons of African ancestry will bring down property values, we will not finance homes for them in this area because it'll bring down the property values of the Anglo persons who were living in these areas. Literally, you couldn't get it because of how you looked and the fear that your presence, owning property that you're paying for, by the way, we would always pay too much for the property. We would. And then be there, and people of the opinion that you would somehow bring the property values down. Well, thank God for Burroughs versus Jackson and Shelley versus Kramer. These were lawsuits that helped us to eliminate restrictive covenants. There were covenants that you could have in your deed that said you can't sell this property to a Black person.
Right.
Restrictive covenants. Laws got rid of those. But moving forward, we've done some research. I was the chairperson of the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee of Financial Services in the last Congress, under the leadership of the Honorable Maxine Waters. And under the leadership of the Honorable Maxine Waters, we had the big banks to come in. And we discovered that they have a connectivity to slavery through their predecessor institutions, because they would lend money through their predecessor institutions to persons who would buy people, treat them as chattels, and if they didn't pay their notes on the chattels, the people, the bank would repossess the people. There has to be some atonement for that. There also was a case of insurance companies that would insure people. And if the person that was insured died, the master would then get some compensation for the servant's death. There has to be some atonement for that. But there also has to be atonement for what's happening to this day, when persons of color go into banks with better credit, with better education, more qualified to get a loan. They get a loan with a higher interest rate and will probably get less money. We know this because there's something called testing, where you send people in of different hues and you get different results. And we find quite often that people of color are still to this day being discriminated against, and it's being done with impunity. Well, we had a bill in the last Congress that we're introducing again in this Congress that makes it a crime to do that. You see, if you defraud the bank, you can be fined as a criminal penalty up to $1 million. But if the bank defrauds you, no such penalty exists. Well, we now have added a penalty. If the bank defrauds you, robs you of your future by denying you a loan that you're qualified for, then there should be some penalty. Yes, we're still dealing with that supremacy as it has become more covert, not nearly as overt, but still it steals our future and prevents us from building generational wealth.
that is so important for people to understand the how it's been institutionalized.
Yes.
White supremacy, racism, slavery was built by institutions. It was not just an individual act of a bad person acting badly towards an enslaved African. It was part of public policy. And I'm so glad that you've highlighted that. And to that point, before there can be atonement, there must be acknowledgement.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so you see the pushback and the resistance to that on a national scale. 3 years ago, in light of what happened to George Floyd, there was this moment of racial reconciliation that we went through. But 3 years later, there seems to be some significant resistance to that now. What are your thoughts on that? And what do you believe we can do to address those concerns?
Well, you laid a proper predicate for my commentary. Because you're right, there was resistance to the reconciliation movement that took place. And the resistance has, to a certain extent, quieted that movement. Well, I believe we need a Department of Reconciliation, a department rather than a commission, because a department would be like the Department of Labor, the Department of Education, Department of Commerce, and it would continue from one presidency to the next. And the Secretary of Reconciliation will report to the president, just as the Secretary of Commerce reports to the president on issues related to commerce, or the Secretary of Labor reports on issues related to labor. We would have a secretary reporting on issues related to reconciliation with undersecretaries of reconciliation. And the mission would be to reconcile not only the injustices perpetrated against persons of African ancestry, but also the indigenous population, the people who were here when the Europeans arrived, when the Africans arrived, the people who were already here, who were uprooted from their land and forced to be moved across country and what was called the Trail of Tears. I mean, there has to be some reconciliation for that. Hundreds died along the way, suffered. There has to be some reconciliation for the people who were placed in these camps when we were at war and they were of Asian ancestry, when we were at war with Japan. Camps. Reconciliation. We can do this. This is what a great country does, reconciles. We have fought to make sure that there has been some degree of reconciliation and compensation for our brothers and sisters who are Jewish. I've supported that. I think that we have to do it. We have a Holocaust Remembrance Day. I support that. Well, I think we have to reconcile in this country with a Slavery Remembrance Day. I think we have to reconcile in this country by having the enslaved people receive a Congressional Gold Medal, just as we've given it to the enslavers, the Confederate soldiers. We did it in 1956. Let's do this for the enslaved people as well, honor them, commemorate their lives, but also there has to be some recompense. There has to be some atonement, and there has to be some what we commonly call some sort of money that's paid. I say money, it could be reparations, could be in other forms, but reparation. But there are some people who believe that it ought to be money, and to a certain extent, I do too, but there are other means of doing it. But those reparations would be something that the Department of Reconciliation would have the opportunity to help us perfect. We could have Jackson Lee, Congresswoman, has a bill for a study. Well, that Department of Reconciliation would facilitate that study. The other Congresswoman Lee has, Barbara Lee, California, had a bill to have us have a commission for truth and justice. Well, we could implement that with the Department of Reconciliation. So I see the Department of Reconciliation as being the facilitating agency for all of these other things that should take place. It's time for us to move in this direction. I don't think things happen overnight, but I am pleased that President Biden has recognized Slavery Remembrance Day. He did so with a press release. We have legislation for the Congressional Gold Medal. We have many people who have signed on to it. Hopefully we'll get that done. But then we also have another concern that the Department of Reconciliation might deal with, because the Senate's not doing it. The Russell Senate Office Building is a symbol of national shame. Senator Russell fought anti-lynching legislation. Senator Russell was one of the authors of the Southern Manifesto. He fought integration. There should be no building honoring him that taxpayers' dollars are supporting. And that's what's happening with the Russell Senate Office Building. I'm a one-person protest. I will not go into the building. I've been invited there for meetings. I was invited to speak there. I don't go. If I go, it is to protest as a part of my protestation. The Russell Senate Office Building is a symbol of national shame, and the Senate ought to be ashamed, because it only but has the will to do for a building that it occupies, to do for that building what is done for military bases across this country. We're changing names, taking the names of Confederate generals off of these bases, but the Senate won't take the name of a self-proclaimed white supremacist off of a building that it occupies. How shameful it is.
Your agenda is critically important to elevate the conversation around racial reconciliation, atonement, issues of reparations. Let me ask you this: what role should lawyers play, specifically the American Bar Association, our section of civil rights and social justice? How can we partner with you? How can we work with you? What should lawyers be doing in this moment to elevate these issues? And in ways, how can we help support legislation that you are sponsoring?
Well, thank you. It's a great question. And lawyers are ideally suited to be engaged in this process, because first of all, they bring credibility just by virtue of being lawyers. And that's important. But here's what's needed. I think we need a petition that would have literally hundreds of thousands of names on it, indicating that the Russell Senate Office Building, the name ought to change on that building, or that we need a Department of Reconciliation, or that we need the Congressional Gold Medal for the enslaved persons who laid the economic foundation. I call them the foundational mothers and fathers of the country. Need a petition with saying, let's honor them, let's commemorate their lives. So a petitions for all of these. Also, we need conversations. When we encounter members of Congress, there is no law that prohibits us from talking to them about issues of concern. We do it all the time. Conversations, quiet conversations about how we need to make these changes. When there appears to be a groundswell, and there is a belief that people will no longer be the perfect victim. People have decided that this victimhood does not apply to us. We're going to speak up. We believe that these changes are necessary. And don't expect me to be the perfect victim and allow character assassination of people who built the country. Then that's what's happened. They've been disrespected. So speak up on these things. And when you have, as you did with the event at Georgetown University, when you had your event there and you brought in people to talk about economic justice, make this a part of the agenda of the civil rights section that you happen to chair if you can. And finally, I would say do this. Let people know that I'm not going in the Russell Office Building. I won't go in. Now, if you have an event there, you can have it, but you don't expect me to attend it, and don't have any events there. Start sending letters. Let people know that we don't see that as a place where we can allow our integrity to be encroached upon, because you disrespect yourself when you go in. If you know now what we've shared. Now, if you didn't know, that's different. But if you know who Richard Russell was and you go in, you are being the perfect victim. You're doing exactly what people would have you do, which is disrespect yourself and your ancestors. For me, I tell people, I'm the proud descendant of the enslaved people who laid the economic foundation for this country. And as such, I will not disrespect myself by going into a building named after a self-proclaimed white supremacist. He proclaimed himself a white supremacist. I'm not going in that building.
Congressman Green, you have been a tremendous voice on these issues. We thank you for your partnership and our friendship and your support of our section. How can people follow you? How can people find you and connect with you who want to support the work you're doing?
Well, thank you. Obviously, we are right here in Congress. Al Green, MC9 at mail.house.gov. That's an email address, Al Green, MC9 at mail.house.gov. I give my phone number out, so don't be alarmed when I do so. It is 713-858-8787, repeating 713-858-8787. I don't take messages, but I do return calls that come to the phone. Every number that shows up, I return a call to return my call to that number. And I would share this with you. Nobody has to listen to emails, the text messages and that sort of thing, because I don't get them on this phone. It's just for talking to people. This is what the phone is for. I believe in talking to people. So you can call me and we'll talk about it, and be honored to come and visit with people who would like to hear more about the Conscious Agenda. Be my honor to do so. And I appreciate what you're doing. What you have done with the ABA section on civil rights is awesome. It really is. And I also salute you for, I think you were former president of a National Bar Association.
It was.
Yes. So Mr. President, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your service. You're making a difference.
Thank you, Congressman. You've been a delight today. Thank you for your friendship. We look forward to continuing to work with you and partnering with you and your colleagues on Capitol Hill. Thank you all for listening today. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.